The strange thing about America is this. The world's most powerful economy is not truly controlled by the people who live in it. It's controlled by people most Americans will never meet, never vote for, and never even see. Because in the United States, ownership isn't loud. It doesn't walk on the streets or wave flags. Real ownership hides in silence, behind shell companies, private equity firms, and interlocking corporate boards that stretch across oceans. This is Hidden Finance File, where money, power, and truth collide. To understand who really owns America, you have to first understand a paradox. The country built on the idea of freedom is run by invisible hands that operate beyond public view. Not in smoky rooms filled with conspiracies, but in board meetings, asset structures, and capital flows that shape everything from the price of bread to the direction of wars. America's economy is a massive stage with millions of actors, but only a handful write the script. Who are they? They're the ones who don't appear on magazine covers despite controlling trillions. They're the ones whose influence outlives elections, and they're the ones who understand a truth the average person never sees, that ownership is not about possession, but about leverage. Not about what you hold, but what you control. The story begins with 3 letters, ETF, Exchange-Traded Funds. Simple, harmless-sounding investment tools that millions of Americans use without realizing that behind them stand 3 giants, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, who together manage over $20 trillion. More than the GDP of America, more than the value of every publicly traded company in China, more than the combined wealth of every billionaire on Earth. These firms don't just invest in companies, they own pieces of almost all of them. The banks, the tech giants, the oil producers, the media networks, the pharmacies, the airlines, the food suppliers, they're everywhere, quietly, efficiently, permanently. Some Americans believe their vote decides the country's future, but in the financial world, votes are cast not by individuals, but by shares. 1 share, 1 vote. 1 trillion shares, 1 trillion votes. And these firms hold the voting power that shapes the direction of corporate America. But the paradox runs deeper. Because even these giants, the firms that seem to own America, are themselves owned by something stranger. Layers of passive investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and insurance pools. A web so vast that asking who owns what becomes like asking who owns the ocean. Yet the answer is never everyone. The answer is always a few. Real ownership in America is not straightforward. It's a maze built on top of a labyrinth, wrapped inside a legal system that rewards complexity. And that maze leads to unexpected places, to families whose wealth began a century ago, to holding companies older than the Great Depression, to institutions that don't die, don't retire, and don't announce themselves. Because what truly controls the U.S. economy isn't just money, it's continuity, the ability to exist beyond time. While the average American works for wages that vanish every month, wealth at the top compounds in silence, accumulating not like income, but like empire. Empire built without borders. Empire built without armies. Empire built on ownership. But as we peel back the next layer, another truth begins to surface. Ownership is not just about who holds the assets. It's about who can manipulate the structure of the system itself. The way corporations merge, the way debt is created, the way monetary policy flows through every household like invisible electricity. Because beneath the CEOs and the hedge fund managers lies an even deeper power, one that doesn't seek headlines, doesn't claim titles, and doesn't need public approval. A power that understands that the true value of America is not in its companies, but in its mechanisms. And the further we go, the more the illusion fades. The more we see that the U.S. economy isn't a marketplace, it's an architecture. And someone designed it, someone maintains it, someone benefits from its every shift and tremor. But the real revelation, The one that waits just beyond this layer is even more unsettling, because it challenges the very idea of ownership itself. It forces us to ask a question few Americans ever consider. If the richest entities don't technically own America, then who does? And the answer begins where we go next. The question we ended on lingers like a shadow. If the richest institutions don't truly own America, then who does? Because the deeper you travel into the architecture of power, the more you realize that ownership isn't a name on a document, it's a force that shapes outcomes. And behind every force is an engineer. To uncover that engineer, we have to shift our gaze from the corporations and financial giants to something far more elusive, the system that sustains them. A system built on laws, incentives, and invisible privileges woven together so tightly that they can outlive recessions, scandals, and even the people who designed them. The real owners of America aren't the ones holding the assets. They're the ones who shape the rules that decide how assets behave. Look at the Federal Reserve. Not a government agency, not a private corporation. Something in between. A hybrid institution that influences interest rates, liquidity, and the very heartbeat of the financial system. It doesn't print money in the physical sense. It prints confidence, and confidence in a debt-powered economy is worth more than gold. When the Fed moves, trillions react. Pensions tremble, mortgages shift, markets breathe differently. But even the Fed is not a single mind. It's a constellation of regional banks, governed by boards filled with executives from the same corporations the Fed is meant to oversee. A loop of influence so elegant, so self-sustaining, that it quietly dissolves the boundary between regulator and regulated. And that loop is where ownership begins to change shape. Because ownership isn't only about assets, it's about access. Who gets early information? Who gets favorable credit? Who gets rescued when the world collapses? In 2008, when the economy shattered, it wasn't the homeowners or small businesses that were saved first. It was the institutions whose survival defined the survival of the system. AIG, rescued. Citigroup, rescued. Morgan Stanley, shielded. Goldman Sachs, protected. Not because they were innocent, but because they were essential. That is the blueprint of modern ownership. The entities that cannot be allowed to fall are the ones that quietly govern the gravity of the entire economy. And yet, even they are not the final layer. Because behind every bailout, behind every emergency lending program, behind every sweeping financial decision, there is something even more powerful than institutions: collective leverage. The leverage held by bond markets, the leverage held by global creditors, the leverage held by foreign governments who own slices of America's debt, China, Japan, the UK, oil-exporting nations. They don't own America, but they own the obligations that America must fulfill. And in a world where power follows debt, creditors become silent shareholders of destiny. But the paradox doesn't stop there. Because while foreign nations hold U.S. treasuries, America holds something even more valuable in return: global influence. The dollar isn't just a currency, it's a throne. And anyone who sits close to that throne becomes part of the invisible hierarchy that shapes the world's largest economy. Which brings us to the layer of ownership most Americans never see: the networks. Networks of attorneys, lobbyists, think tanks, foundations, trade associations, and consulting firms that whisper policy into existence. They don't pass laws, they guide them. They don't appear on ballots, they influence the ones who do. They don't run campaigns, they fund the machinery that ensures the results align with long-term interests. These networks don't just shape the present, they shape the trajectory of the future. Tax codes, regulatory exemptions, monetary policy frameworks, corporate governance standards, all sculpted by people whose names will never trend, whose faces will never appear on cable news, and whose power depends entirely on remaining unseen. And at the center of all of this lies a truth that feels almost philosophical. America is not owned by individuals. It's owned by structures. Structures maintained by those who understand them. And as we step deeper into this architecture, past the corporations, past the institutions, past the networks, we finally approach the most hidden layer of all. A layer that doesn't just influence the economy, it defines the meaning of ownership itself. The layer where power is no longer measured in dollars, assets, or influence, but in the ability to shape the boundaries of the entire game. And that is where the real answer begins to reveal itself. The deeper you look into America's financial machine, the more the shadows start to feel familiar. Because the pattern we uncovered in the last chapter doesn't end with banks, with capital markets, or with billionaires. It continues into something even stranger, something older than the United States itself. A rehook to remind you, the true power of America was never about who stood in front of the camera, but about who arranged the stage behind it. That idea becomes clearer when you follow the money into the spaces where ordinary eyes are not meant to look. Quiet offices inside the Federal Reserve System, where decisions affecting every American wallet are made without a single vote from the public. Whispering hallways inside century-old institutions whose founders are long dead but whose strategies still guide modern markets. Rooms where economic doctrine is not debated, it is shaped. Because the most extraordinary truth is this: the U.S. economy is not governed by a single mastermind. It is governed by an ecosystem of power, an interlocking web of institutions that survive presidents, outlive crises, and function almost like America's financial DNA. Presidents change, Congress shifts, public sentiment rises and falls like tides. But these institutions, they stay, silent, steady, watching. The Federal Reserve, for example, is technically a public institution, yet its regional banks are privately owned. A paradox that makes it both accountable and untouchable at the same time. It does not print money. It creates it digitally, with keystrokes that ripple across markets within seconds. A trillion-dollar decision can be made by a handful of people, most of whom will never appear on your television. Then there are the families, old financial dynasties whose influence has faded from newspapers but not from balance sheets. The Morgans, the Mellons, the Phipps, the Rockefellers. Their names don't dominate headlines anymore, but their trusts, foundations, and legacy capital still quietly fuel industries, shape philanthropic priorities, and stabilize markets during moments of panic. Wealth that has been compounding for over a century moves with a patience no government timeline could match. And beyond all this is something even more elusive: the global financial order. Sovereign wealth funds from abroad owning slices of American corporations. Multinational banks moving capital across borders in seconds. Algorithmic traders influencing markets not with emotion, but with mathematics. The economy of the United States is deeply American, and also not American at all. A paradox of globalization. The nation that built the modern financial world no longer fully owns it. But there's a final twist, and it's perhaps the most paradoxical of all. For all this power, all these institutions, all these billionaires and banks and boards, the U.S. economy is still driven by a force no one can fully control. Trust, invisible, psychological, fragile. Every loan, every investment, every dollar in your pocket is built on belief. Belief that the system will hold. Belief that debts will be repaid. Belief that the markets will open tomorrow morning and that the institutions we've talked about will continue to function. America's real power isn't just in money. It's in the faith that money will matter tomorrow. And when trust falters, even the giants tremble. Look at 2008. The financial crisis did not begin with a law or a war. It began with disbelief, a quiet shattering of confidence that cascaded into the collapse of banks worth more than many countries. The world saw how fragile the architecture truly was. But it also saw how quickly those same shadowed institutions, central banks, legacy financiers, economic councils, moved to stabilize the system. They were invisible when the system was calm. They became undeniable when it cracked. So who owns America? The simple answer is no one. The real answer is everyone who can influence its trust, its currency, its credit, its institutions, its markets, its story. America is not controlled by a single hand. It is shaped by many hands, each holding a small piece of a much larger lever. A dance of institutions, individuals, algorithms, memories, and expectations, all moving in an endless cycle of power and belief. And maybe that's the truth we often miss. The U.S. economy isn't a machine. It's a living organism, breathing, growing, evolving, shaped by forces both seen and unseen. You, watching this right now, are part of it. Your choices, your spending, your fears, your hopes, they all feed the system. You are not outside the story. You are woven into it. In the end, the hidden owners of America are not just the ones who sit in boardrooms or write economic policy. They are the ones who understand the deeper truth. The U.S. economy runs on a story. And the ones who shape that story, quietly, subtly, consistently, are the ones who shape the nation. If this journey made you think differently, stay with us. Like, comment, and subscribe to Hidden Finance File, where the secrets behind money, power, and history are always waiting beneath the surface.